President of the Center for American Action Fund. I want to thank you for joining us about this critical conversation about Russia's role in the world, Russia's role vis-a-vis the United States, and Russia's intentions on the global stage. I cannot overstate how important it is to have a full understanding of the ends and goals of the Russian government, especially as we look at what happened in the election and what has happened over the last several years vis-a-vis Russia. I'm particularly excited to have Senator Shaheen here because she knows full well as a senator on the Foreign Relations Committee and on the Armed Services Committee, she has a perspective through both of these assignments about what Russia's intentions are and how they are acting internationally, acting vis-a-vis Europe, acting vis-a-vis Asia, acting vis-a-vis the United States to achieve ends that are really in contravention to the goals of the United States. She has a unique perspective. She's been a leader on the issues regarding Russia's nuclear arsenal, has been an incredible champion of U.S. European leadership, and I can't think of really anyone better to give us the perspective on what's happening vis-a-vis the United States. We have a lot of conversations about how Russia interfered in the elections, but I think people sometimes lose sight of the fact of why that happened, what they were trying to accomplish, how we have a different perspective on a number of issues, and how their election interference is actually aimed at affecting those issues. So with that, Senator Shaheen, I welcome you to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Neera, for that very nice introduction, and thank you all for being here. You survived the red line breakdown this morning, those of you who are here, and to those of you who are online, thank you for joining us as we live stream this as well. As Neera said, what I hope to do today in my remarks is to put Russia's interference in our election into a broader geopolitical context. As we know, in both the U.S. and Europe, the post-war order faces a growing and unprecedented threat. And that threat, very simply put, is Vladimir Putin's Russia. Putin's goal is to restore Russia as a dominant power and to recreate a Soviet-style sphere of influence along its border. Now, to that end, his strategy is to disrupt, divide, and weaken the transatlantic alliance. The American people need to fully understand what Putin is doing, and together with our allies, we need to stop him. As you all know very well, over the last decade, the United States and our friends in Europe have witnessed the full spectrum of Russia's acts of aggression, from covert influence campaigns to cyber attacks to outright military invasions. Meantime, Russia has dramatically modernized and expanded its military, and it regularly deploys forces close to NATO's border to intimidate our allies. It's violated the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, by deploying ground-launched ballistic and cruise missiles capable of striking targets in the West. But Putin dramatically raised the stakes for the U.S. by interfering in our 2016 election. In January, the Director of National Intelligence released a declassified report on Russia's activities during the election. And I'm going to read this again because I know probably everybody in this room and everyone watching has read it. But I think it's important because it's so dramatic when you think about the unanimity among the intelligence community. What that declassified report stated about Russia is, and I quote, "We assess Russian President Vladimir Putin ordered an influence campaign in 2016 aimed at the U.S. presidential election. Russia's goals were to undermine public faith in the U.S. democratic process, denigrate Secretary Clinton, and harm her electability and potential presidency. We further assess Putin and the Russian government developed a clear preference for President-elect Trump." And the report continues. Moscow's influence campaign followed a Russian messaging strategy that blends covert intelligence operations, such as cyber activity, with overt efforts by Russia's government agencies, state-funded media, third-party intermediaries, and paid social media users or trolls. Now, when you listen to that agreement among the entire intelligence community in the United States, every American should be outraged. And this outrage isn't about party, it's not about partisanship, it's about patriotism and defending America's democracy, which is under attack by Russia. In testimony before the Senate Armed Services Committee last December, Dr. Robert Kagan of Brookings said that Russia's goal is to subvert Western democracies. And he said, and I'm quoting again, "For the United States to ignore this Russian tactic, and particularly now that it's been deployed against the United States, is to cede to Moscow a powerful tool of modern geopolitical warfare." This is not just a military buildup in Russia. It's an effort to undermine democratic institutions in the West. Researchers have traced countless false news stories to a common source, the Kremlin's $1.4 billion propaganda machine, which reaches some 600 million people across 130 countries and in 30 languages. The Associated Press has identified a building in Moscow where an estimated 400 internet trolls, fluent in English and well-versed in American politics, work 12-hour shifts creating narratives and false news stories. And these stories are then seeded on the internet, they get validated, they get passed on by popular websites, and many eventually end up on our radios, our TVs, and our smartphones. Now, remember back when President Trump tweeted that former President Obama had wiretapped Trump Tower? Well, the suspected original source for that allegation was a fake news story on RT News, the Russian international TV network. An influential Russian strategist, General Valery Gerasimov, has written that future Russian wars will be fought with a 4-to-1 ratio, 4-to-1, of non-military to military actions. Non-military measures, propaganda, fake news stories, and so on, will shape the political and social landscape of the targeted country. Well, we see it today because Russia is working hard to shape the political and social landscape in Europe. It's stoking populist nationalism across Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and it's working to destabilize countries that seek closer ties to the West. Back in February, a congressional delegation went to the annual Munich Security Conference, and one of the people we met with was the Prime Minister of Montenegro, Djukanovic. He had led his country's successful effort to join NATO. Well, the Prime Minister described to us in vivid detail Russians' efforts to assassinate him before their elections and to install a pro-Kremlin party in a coup attempt to prevent them from joining NATO. And of course, as we watch what's happening now in France and look forward to the German elections, we see Russian interference again. The director of Germany's equivalent of the FBI told the New York Times that he's seen an increase in aggressive cyber espionage targeting German politicians. And in the French election, we know that Putin, like our president, openly supports Marine Le Pen, who has threatened to take France out of the European Union. She's gotten millions of euros from a Russian bank for her campaign. And then on Tuesday, we heard that a London-based security firm reported that the most recent cyber attacks on the presidential frontrunner, Emmanuel Macron, carried the same digital fingerprints as the Russian group that hacked the Democratic National Committee. But despite all of this evidence, President Trump continues to publicly reject the idea that Russia interfered in the 2016 election, and his statements have had a disturbing impact on public opinion. A CBS News poll in late March found that 64% of Republicans deny that Russia interfered in our election, and the danger is that partisan divisions will allow Putin to interfere in our election with no punishment and no consequences. And an even more dangerous prospect is that Russian interference in American elections could become normalized. If Russia gets a pass on 2016, it could interfere in future U.S. elections not only at the presidential level, but at the House and Senate level. In testimony before the House Intelligence Committee last month, NSA Director Admiral Mike Rogers said, quote, "I fully expect them to continue this level of activity because our sense is that they have come to the conclusion that it generated a positive outcome for them," end quote. Again, this should outrage all of us as patriotic Americans. Our country has been attacked by Russia. We must be united around one question: how do we prevent a recurrence of Putin's interference in our election? For starters, the American public needs to know the facts about that interference. What did the Russians do, and how did they do it? The last time our country was attacked, we created the National Commission on Terrorist Attacks on the United States, the 9/11 Commission. That commission was tasked with preparing a full and complete account of the 9/11 attacks and providing recommendations to guard against future attacks. We need exactly this kind of independent, nonpartisan investigation of the Russia attack on our democracy so that we can prevent future attacks and so that the American people can understand what happened. On Monday, an NBC News Wall Street Journal poll found that 73% of Americans want an independent, nonpartisan commission instead of Congress to investigate Russia's involvement in the 2016 election. But I think Putin's challenge to us is about more than hacking America's democracy. The architecture of alliances and partnerships that has been at the heart of our national security and the stability that we've experienced throughout the West and throughout much of the world for more than 7 decades is also at risk. We need a bolder, more aggressive strategy for punishing Russia and for countering its efforts to undermine our democracies. I think there should be 4 components to this strategy, at least: imposing more rigorous sanctions, bolstering NATO and our allies, demonstrating stronger support for Ukraine, and countering the Russian propaganda juggernaut. So first, on sanctions. I've joined with a bipartisan group of senators led by John McCain and Ben Cardin to advance legislation imposing new, tougher, comprehensive sanctions on Russia, including on their energy sector. Second, in concert with our NATO allies, we need to counter Russia militarily. At the NATO summit in Warsaw last summer, the alliance ratified decisions to deploy multinational battalions, including U.S. troops and armor, to the Baltic states and Eastern Europe. At the NATO summit next month in Brussels, we need to do more, including formally calling Russia to account for violating the INF nuclear treaty. Third, we need to redouble our support for Ukraine. Ukraine was attacked because it dared to chart an independent pro-Western course. Putin clearly sees Ukraine as a proxy, a place to set an example. If Russia can violate Ukraine's sovereignty, then it can do the same with other countries formerly in the Soviet Union or its sphere of influence. Conversely, if Ukrainian democracy succeeds, this would send a hopeful message to pro-democracy activists, even in Russia. Dan Baer, who's the former ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, told our Senate Foreign Relations Committee that the greatest way to support the future of democracy in Russia is to support the democratic future that is being built in Ukraine today. Finally, the U.S. and Europe must be more aggressive in exposing and countering Russia's propaganda machine. The McCain-Cardin sanctions legislation would create a European democracy initiative that, among other things, would support objective Russian-language independent media and watchdog groups working to combat corruption. Regrettably, what we're seeing from the Trump administration is going the other way. The administration has proposed draconian cuts to the State Department budget, as well as the elimination of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and other news sources that are trusted and listened to within Russia. I think that's a mistake. We should be committing more resources, not less, to these successful efforts to challenge Russia in the information space. And we also need to expose disinformation here in the United States that's being put out by Russia. For example, following the chemical attacks on Syrian civilians earlier this month, RT News promoted Russia's claim that rebel groups, not the Assad regime, were responsible. Well, you may think nobody really believed that in the United States, but I was at a town hall meeting in New Hampshire last week, and I had a woman stand up and tell me the evidence that she had that showed that Assad was not responsible. This kind of disinformation has an impact on people. And it's time to unmask RT News, which spends $400 million on its Washington bureau alone. It has more YouTube subscribers than any other broadcaster, including the BBG. Now, to that end, I've introduced legislation to prevent RT from using a shell corporation to dodge U.S. laws and to require documentation on their funding sources and foreign connections. Russia's interference in the 2016 election is a profound test for our country. We must honestly acknowledge that democracy and democratic values are under attack in both Europe and in the United States. You know, in his inaugural address, President Kennedy, speaking in a Cold War context, said, and I quote, "In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger." Well, today, ladies and gentlemen, it is our turn. And I believe that our democracy and the other democracies in the West, the Transatlantic Alliance, are worth fighting for. And we cannot allow partisanship to keep us from taking action. We must respond because our national security and our democracy are at stake. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit of a hiccup here. Thank you so much, Senator. I have so many questions to ask on so many of the issues you raised, but let me start off with one of the harder issues to deal with substantively. You referenced essentially how Russia has launched a propaganda effort that's married to a disinformation effort. So not only do they have Russia Today or RT News, but they are also using social media to create fake news, disinformation. Obviously, there's been a lot of written both by academics as well as in the intelligence report how they were using social media to denigrate Hillary Clinton in the election and then also sort of boost Donald Trump. We're seeing also, obviously, in the French elections, a wide-scale hacking operation against Macron, who is now the only one standing in the way of a Le Pen leadership of France. I'd like to just ask you a theoretical question or sort of a broad question, which is, as we try to tackle this, you know, the challenge here is that you have a state actor essentially willing to use or misuse the tools of information to distort democracies, right? Provide fake information to people, tell people wrong things. People who are sort of susceptible to that believe it. And how does a democracy really respond to that? I think we would have rightly some criticism if American intelligence forces started using disinformation campaigns in Russia, for example. So how do you, I mean, I sort of see like we have an asymmetry problem here in how we can respond to what Russia's doing. And obviously in our elections, I could go on all day, our press was not particularly good at discerning this challenge itself.
Well, you're right. That's one of the big challenges about trying to address this is because we have a First Amendment and we believe in freedom of speech, and we don't believe that the state should control the media and that we should put out propaganda. We think we should try and provide facts and information, and people should make their own decisions. So that is one of the huge challenges that we face. But you know, we faced this challenge also during the Cold War.
Yes, that's true.
We
Good
had
point.
we had a very good structure that included Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, other ways to broadcast into Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union to not to provide propaganda, but to provide accurate information so that people could understand what was going on. And unfortunately, after the Cold War ended and the fall of the Berlin Wall, we took apart that structure that we had. And so I think we've got to look at what we can recover from that, what worked, and we have a broadcasting board of governors, as I said. We still have Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and other ways, Radio Liberty, that are able to get out information. And so we should do that, and that's why I think it's the wrong direction to defund and eliminate those programs. I think that's not the right direction to go to. But then we also need to think about how we can prevent blatant violations of our law.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm trying to do in my legislation that would address Sputnik and RT News and other information that is designed to not comply. You know, we're not going to prevent people from watching RT, nor should we, but we should make sure that they know who's funding it.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and what they're saying. And that's what my legislation is designed to do.
No, I really commend people to look at the legislation. It's really important. I want to say how much I appreciate that you gave the context of Russia's actions over the last several years and what its real ambitions are and why they would act to influence our election, as they are doing in France. And I would also note that they have 6 weeks of emails from the German parliament, and their election is coming up as well. So this is an assault across democracies, and I really appreciate you providing the context of the difference we have with them and why they would do it. I'd like to ask you, though, from your perch on both of these committees, what you think about the Trump administration's approach. I mean, it's, from one vantage point, you could say a president who is not particularly consistent on a range of topics has actually taken the Russian side on a whole host of issues. Ukraine, much more differential. EU, very critical. Brexit. Syria, there was this recent bombing, but immediately after the bombing said everything and tweeted out everything will work out with Russia. So how do you, it seems to me like there are two sides of that coin. And what are your concerns about the administration's position, and who can help lead that if the administration isn't going to?
Well, I'm very concerned about what the administration's position is, and as I said, it's one of the reasons I felt like it was important to read the conclusions of the Intelligence Committee with respect to the election, because this is not something that's made up by partisans. This is factual conclusions that the intelligence community has come to based on information. And one of the challenges that we have is not having a transparent process where the public can see what actions have been taken, how an investigation of the influence in our elections has happened, and what should be done about it. And so I think that's a real concern. I remember last year in September, when we were first beginning to get some reports about what was happening with Russia, I called on the Foreign Relations Committee to do a hearing on what was happening, because I think the more it's behind closed doors, the harder it is for people to really understand what's going on. And the fact that we now have, 70% of people who say we need an independent investigation really speaks to the concerns out there in the public. And again, it's disappointing to me that the president, despite all of that overwhelming evidence, has still failed to acknowledge that there's something going on there, and to develop a coherent strategy with respect to Russia, because it's not just about our democracy. It's about what's happening with other democracies in Europe, as you said. It's about a military buildup that's going on in Russia. It's about the effort, the violation of the INF Treaty, another look that they're taking at nuclear arms buildup, and the rhetoric out of the president about the same thing, about our nuclear arsenal. So I think there are a lot of reasons for people to be concerned, and why we really need a look at what happened that everybody in America can see and understand.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'll move off to other topics, but just on this one issue, it's strikes me as odd, like, given all the questions, wouldn't just your normal response as a human being like, let's have an independent investigation, right? I mean, let's figure it out. Particularly if you think Russia didn't actually swing the election, then wouldn't more information be more useful than second? I mean, especially at this point where there's quite, stories every day and questions.
Well, that's swirling. Right. I mean, all of the coverage of the first 100 days of this administration have talked about the overwhelming influence that the Russia story has had in what the administration has done. So why not get the information out, let people know what's happened? If you say it's not true and you don't have concerns, then let the public know.
A deep mystery, I am sure. I want to also just commend, during Secretary Tillerson's nomination hearing, you asked several tough questions about the rule of law in Russia and the need for continued sanctions. And he answered, and I quote, I thinks it's important that we keep the status quo until we're able to develop what our approach is going to be. You talked about sanctions, how can we, I think for so many people, they're worried about what's happening with Russia. They're worried about a sort of increased militarization across the board. Where they don't have a lot of confidence in a Trump administration, particularly given the Russia story and actually being strong opponents of that. What actions are the Congress taking? Where are leaders going on this that can be that voice? Senator McCain has talked about increased sanctions. Is there a possibility of that in the House? Where do you see all that going?
Well, I do applaud the good bipartisan work that's going on in Congress among a number of our colleagues who have been willing to stand up and say, we need to get to the bottom of this. We need to hold Russia accountable. We need to have tougher sanctions. The legislation that Senator McCain and Senator Cardin are leading that's bipartisan, equal number of Republicans and Democrats. It's a good example of the effort to try and hold Russia accountable. The fact that they still have not complied with the Minsk II agreements with respect to Ukraine is another example of why it's important, because if they can get away with interfering in our elections, if they can get away with interfering in the European elections, if they can get away with not coming to the table in terms of Ukraine and continuing to agitate and support elements in eastern Ukraine who are going to keep up that fight, then they're going to think they can take the next step and go into some other country, that they can continue to hack elections. And so what we know about Russia's behavior under Putin is that he understands strength and power, and when they are held accountable, then they hopefully will begin to behave differently.
I'm going to turn it to questions. I'm going to just ask one last question, but think through your questions. I'll ask you to identify who you are and then get to your question. But you mentioned Russia, RT News, and some of the fake news efforts that we've seen and how it's actually permeating. And I think one of the concerns is that we do see in other countries and in our country a kind of adherence to some of this fake news, not just on the far right, but even a little bit on the left, or on some of the left. And then, so how do you, particularly like the RT story on, there are no moderate rebels in Syria. Everyone who's fighting Assad is actually a terrorist. We know that's not true, but that is definitely the Russian talking points which get circulated on RT News. What can we do to address those challenges where, you have a state actor that's really just pushing out an agenda and it's getting adherents? There are members of Congress who are saying those things now. And so, do you have a strategy or a recommendation, or is it just like we have to fight facts with, or fake news with facts? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as I said, this came up at this town hall
Yeah,
meeting.
exactly.
And it was very interesting because the woman was clearly spouting something that she had heard from some news source. And there happened to be 2 Syrians in the audience.
Oh.
And they went over afterwards, after I had talked to her and explained that, that was not accurate. And I thought that was really helpful for them to individually talk about what they had seen and what they were hearing from family members and folks in Syria. So I do think that individual pushback on the part of each of us when we see something, don't assume that people are not going to believe it, because sadly, so much of what's getting pushed around, people do believe. I was in Warsaw in February, and we were meeting with some officials, and we were talking about this phenomenon in the U.S. and about how people had been susceptible during the election to many of these news stories. And one of the things they said is that we were asking how people in Poland react. Yeah. And they said, well, we've had an experience with Russia. So we don't think we're as susceptible to that kind of propaganda because we've seen it before.
Yeah.
We know what their modus operandi is and how they work. But I do think, again, that we also need some official response. So we do need to support the Broadcasting Board of Governors and their efforts to provide accurate information to people in Eastern Europe and in Russia. We do need, through the State Department, to look at some of the ways that we can make sure that we're putting out accurate information.
Right.
And we certainly need to encourage members of the press and reporters to call this out when they see it and to report on it. I know we have some in this room, so I hope that you will do that as you're thinking about how we should all be responding.
Great, thanks. Questions? Oh, look at all these questions, man. We'll have the mic come over right there.
My name is Stephen Shore. 2 brief points. The first is this is hardly new. The Russians, at least since the Bolshevik Revolution, if not earlier, have tried to influence developments outside their borders. It's just the sophistication and technological input that is new. But my other question is, during the campaign, Trump himself called on the Russians to publicize through WikiLeaks what they had their eavesdropping had accomplished. And it's one thing if a foreign leader is an unwitting recipient of Russian help, and another if someone is a paid agent of a foreign government. Retaliating against Russia could take several forms and has complexities, but impeaching a president for treason is something that the Congress could do on its own. So this is my question. If it turns out that...
Yes, you need to get to the question quickly. Oh, that is my question. Oh, okay. About impeachment writ large, is that the question?
You've not mentioned the possible, were it not probable, willing participation by the Trump campaign in this disinformation, and being an agent of a foreign government, I think, may cross the line into an impeachable offense.
Well, and that's why I think we need an independent investigation that is transparent so we can know, first of all, if that is what happened. We don't have that evidence right now. And then we can take appropriate action. I mean, that's why I compared it to the 9/11 Commission, where we saw a thorough investigation that involved a lot of people in the country that was transparent, and a number of recommendations for how we should address that in the future. So I do think we need that kind of investigation.
I would say, there is a FBI counterintelligence investigation that is actually probing. I mean, as reports out Friday night said that they're seeing someone's leaking out, they're seeing evidence of collusion or suggestion of collusion, but that's something they're investigating. I think the point of the commission is an FBI process is not transparent. Given all the questions, we need a transparent process as well
Right.
for the public because, maybe people are also concerned about the FBI's past acts as well. So a transparent process is super helpful. But there is an FBI investigation right into that question right now.
Thank you. My name is Charles. I was going to ask regarding the U.S.'s own efforts to combat cyber terrorism, cyber warfare. Currently, it's primarily military-based. I mean, the idea being it's like CENTCOM, but for the internet. Do you suggest a transition to a more civilian process headed by the State Department, or having two separate functions? And in addition, what are your feelings about U.S. Efforts to hack other countries, described in theory?
Well, right now we have the two major efforts to defend against cyber terrorism. One is located in the Department of Homeland Security, and one, as you point out, is with the military. And so I think we need to do a better job of coordinating those efforts, and I think that is ongoing. There is an effort to do that. And I also think we need to get the private sector involved. The question of cyber warfare on our behalf, I think, is still under discussion and debate. We have seen some evidence of that in the stories that were uncovered about our efforts to send Iran's nuclear program off track, the Stuxnet virus. So I think that as we look at the future of the security threats that we face in this country, looking at cyber is a big piece of that, and we need to think about how we're going to respond. Right now, we don't have a policy that I'm aware of that lays out a strategy for responding to cyber attacks.
Here, just right there. And just say who you're with, if you can.
My name's Becca. I'm an intern here at CAP, and I'm a student at Georgetown. I wanted to ask, what if an independent investigation, turned up that Russia's interference in our election actually had a great impact? How would this undermine our legitimacy in the international system? And I feel like the long-term effects, just with the legitimacy of our elections and our democracy, would be harmed. Can you just speak to that extent, and if we should really be worried about something like that?
Well, that's why I said I think we need to hold Russia accountable for its actions. Clearly, we have evidence that everyone in the intelligence community has agreed is there that they interfered in our elections. It's not clear if that made the difference in the outcome of the election. It's not clear to what extent the current Trump administration or any individuals who were part of his campaign colluded in that. That's why we need to take a look at that. And then I think take action if that's the case. Now that we would rely on Congress to respond. And that's why, again, I think it's very important that we have bipartisan efforts on these fronts to take a look at what's going on. And I applaud my colleagues who have been willing to stand up and say, we've got to get to the bottom of this.
Why don't we go here and then right here and then behind?
Yes, thank you very much. It's good to have you here and in the U.S. Senate. I'm June O'Connell, a retired U.S. diplomat. And I was a little surprised by your comments about the FBI a minute ago, because the FBI and Comey chose to investigate and reinvestigate the email with Clinton close to the election, when they also knew that there was the prospect of not only collusion among the campaigns, but also, at least Mr. Comey would have been aware of intelligence concerns that a lot of these leaks were coming or being masterminded out of Russia. So this
Yes.
leaves some of us to conclude that the FBI's investigations currently cannot be fully trusted because they've already essentially weighed in. So, how do you respond to the prospect of trusting the FBI or not?
Well, I certainly agree with Neera that the FBI is conducting an ongoing investigation. Director Comey testified to that before the House several weeks ago. And I believe I was not happy about what he did with respect to reopening the case around Hillary Clinton's emails. On the other hand, I believe that I trust that the investigation that's ongoing is going to be thorough and that it will produce information that ultimately will get shared with the American people. And my job as a senator is to try and make sure that happens.
Yeah, I guess I would just add, because I think you were commenting a little bit on what I said. So I think I would just add, I share your concerns, and that I think is one of the reasons, another reason why people do want an independent commission, because an independent commission would then have the ability to actually look at what the FBI uncovered, what it actually did. It would also be a way and a manner in which you would have an external group that could really say this was a thorough investigation. It looked at everything. They may not do that in public because it'll be classified information, but they would definitely do it, and it would be a bipartisan group, not just one side or the other. And so I think that is another reason why there's been an interest in that, because there is, after the election, I mean, no one thinks it more than me, that there was an imbalance in approaches given everything we know now. Right behind, right there.
Karen Johnston, American University. Thank you, Senator, for your remarks. I would like to ask you to give us a sense of the current debate in Congress about the State Department cuts in USAID, the 150 accounts. We know that Secretary Tillerson is going to accept cuts. My question is, perhaps not the 37%, but something. So do you have a sense, at least now in the current debate, about how far, what the cuts will be, and specifically perhaps in what area? Because as you have noted, the State Department has a lot of tools that it can apply to help counter some of these Russian actions, but also in just foreign assistance or, the Global Engagement Center, some of these things. Thank you.
Well, the short answer is no. I don't have any idea at this point. I don't think anybody else does, but there are some hopeful signs. Chairman Corker, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, has said that the president's budget is dead on arrival. The president's budget is usually dead on arrival, regardless of who the president is, when it gets to the Congress.
Deader.
Yes. We know that, Lindsey Graham and Patrick Leahy, who were the chair and ranking member of the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of Appropriations, are both very committed to State Department activities and USAID. So I think they will be very reluctant to cut those programs. I mean, one of the things that I think is inherent in your question is a recognition that the programs that we operate through USAID are really important. They're not just important to many of the countries where we operate, but they're important to America. When we help prevent famine in South Sudan, which hopefully we're going to have some money that's going to go to help that. When we provide for economic empowerment for women in Yemen, that makes a difference in those countries. And people who live there look at that as being positive about the U.S. And, we've heard from so many of our military leaders, whether it's General Secretary Mattis or H.R. McMaster, that if we don't do those diplomatic efforts, if we don't have that economic development assistance for countries, then give me more bullets because I'm going to need them. And I think that's an important reminder to give to not just Secretary Tillerson and the Trump administration, but to give to Americans. You know, one of the questions I get most often from people is concern about how much money goes to foreign assistance. And when you walk people through the fact that it's only about 1% of our federal budget, less than that, then they begin to take a different approach. And when you can talk to them about the changes that it's made for people in places because they have that assistance, then people turn around and they're supportive. So this is something that all of us who care about USAID and the programs that they're administering need to share that with our friends, with our social media networks, and let them know that we need them to weigh in with us as we're fighting these budget battles.
We have time for just 2 more questions right here, and then we'll go in the back.
And we get the gentleman in white because
Yes.
he's from New Hampshire.
Oh, yes. So you're definitely the
Have
last
to
question.
call on New Hampshire.
I'm Michael McFinsky. I'm from Maryland, and I support Senator Cardin. Senator Shaheen, thank you so much for giving us all this perspective. I mean, it's really valuable. We're trying to decipher what is really going on. Now, the FBI can do an investigation. That's one component. But there has to be a prosecutorial arm that really carries that investigation forward and does something with it. Now, recently, the person who was running that part of the Justice Department has resigned to go on to other things. Who do you think will carry that torch?
Well, I think we have to see what the investigation produces and make sure, again, that the American people can see the outcome of that. And depending upon the outcome, there may be action needed. And then, as you know, Jeff Sessions, who is the new Attorney General, has recused himself from investigations. We just confirmed a new Deputy Attorney General who comes from justice and has some good experience. I voted for him, and he got a strong bipartisan vote. So hopefully there will be somebody there who can take action. And again, that's the role of Congress, and frankly, that's the role of the American people. You know, one of the reasons I keep saying we need to have this transparent investigation is because one of the things that we need to do as Americans is make our voices heard about this. You know, I'm old enough to remember Watergate and the Watergate hearings and the fact that it was the American public's concern that ultimately produced those hearings and that led us to an outcome. So hopefully people will weigh in with not just your members of Congress and your senators, but weigh in with your state officials, weigh in with your other elected officials, weigh in with your social networks. Let people know how you feel and what your concerns are, because that's what's going to make a difference here, in addition to whatever Congress does.
I should say that I went to the Kennedy School of Government, and I feel like I was being cold called by one of my professors when you pointed me out. My name is Steve Powell. I'm the managing director of Sino Powell Capital. Previously, I was president of New England Broadcasting, which owned 3 radio stations in New Hampshire, where I was a resident while you were governor. In the movie Patton, at the end of the movie, General Patton, the war had been won. He helped to win it. And he said to his superiors, "Let me invade Russia now. We're going to have to fight them sooner or later. Let's do it now while we have the strength." My question is, 70 years later, do we still have the strength? And related to that, how do you fight somebody who plays by what we consider to be dirty tricks? They always seem to be one step ahead of us. Is Secretary Mattis correct in that sooner or later we'll be needing bullets? And what are your ideas about what tricks we can use to fight them? Thank you.
Those are 2 easy questions from
Yes.
your constituent.
Well, first of all, I think we need to separate the current Russian government from the Russian people and recognize that our fight is not really with the Russian people. It's with Vladimir Putin and the way he is running the Russian government, his autocratic and dictatorial approach to that. One of the things we saw a couple of weeks ago was Russians out in the streets protesting because they they were frustrated about corruption and about the direction of the country. And we had the Russian dissident Vladimir Kara-Murza, who was poisoned twice by the Russian government, by Putin, before one of my committees. And one of the things that he said is that he thought it was very promising to see that in those demonstrations in Russia, there were so many young people.
Yeah.
And that it's the next generation that is going to carry on the fight that ultimately will make a difference in Russia. And so I do think we need to keep that in mind. Putin, no doubt, is a dictator, and as you point out, he has played a very bad hand very well, because Russia is a country that is in decline in terms of their economy, in terms of, if we look at one of the reasons Putin has become such a bad actor is because he's trying to restore Russia's power in the world. He wants to go back to the Soviet era when Russia was considered a major world power. But in the long term, do I think it's going to be in his interest to continue to escalate the fight in Syria as he's looking at the Sunni Arab world? I don't think so. Do I think in the long term it's in his interest, in Russia's interest, to continue to try and expand spheres of influence in Eastern Europe in a way that they've tried to do in Ukraine and Georgia? If you talk to the people of Ukraine and Georgia, most of those people don't want to have anything to do with Russia. If you go to the Baltics and talk to people in the Baltics, they're not interested in going back to being under control of a Russia that is like the Soviet Union. So I think we've got to also play a long game here when we look at Russia, and we've got to be smart about how we do it. We've got to continue sanctions. They're having a real economic impact in Russia, not just the Ukrainian sanctions, but we need to expand and make them more comprehensive. As I said, we need to look at the energy sector in Russia, which is one way they've been able to co-opt some of the European countries because they've been able to control their energy. So we've really got to be smarter about our approach, but long term, as somebody said to me one time, that countries on the decline are much more dangerous than countries on the rise. And I think we're dealing with a country that long term is on the decline if they continue to operate in the way they have.
I just note for that, I mean, part of Putin's rhetoric with his public and the rest of the world is that the United States is at war with the whole country of Russia. And so the point you make that it's our concerns was with the autocratic nature of what the government is doing by, shockingly, a former CIA, a KGB agent, is an important one for all of us. As you can see, there's a lot of interest in both the issue of Russia's role and the issue of an independent investigation, why that is so important to the public. And I just really want to thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for your attention.